Well, good afternoon and welcome along to another edition of Unbelievable as part of Faith Explored. Every Saturday here on Premier Christian Radio, I, Justin Briley, try to bring together some of the brightest minds on two sides of a discussion. And today we're going for a really philosophical debate on the soul and whether it provides evidence for God if there was one. So we're going to be meeting my guests in just a moment's time. Don't forget that later on today you can enjoy the profile as well. That's between 4 and 5 as we meet another Christian in some area of life and ministry. But if you're interested in listening to past programmes of Unbelievable, you want to explore our back catalogue of debates and discussions and resources, why not go to the website premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. And we'll be hearing some of your response to the last few weeks of programming a bit later on today. There's been some really fascinating shows lately and lots of responses, so a mailbag full to relate to you later on today's show. By the way, if you're interested in Unbelievable Conference, just a quick reminder that there is no conference this year. That's for a variety of reasons, but we are planning on some kind of an event in the autumn, so look out for that later on in the year. We'll be able to bring you more details about that. Okay, time to get into today's discussion. Let me introduce my two guests as we talk about the soul and whether it provides evidence for God.
You're unbelievable.
So today, as we debate this question in a philosophical edition of the show, we meet Arif Ahmed and Czar Bernstein. Now, Arif's been on the show before. He's a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Cambridge. He's an atheist and has been on the show a number of times before for philosophical discussion with Christian guests. Czar is a young Christian philosopher currently studying for a BPhil at Oxford University. He's a Christian, but philosophical arguments and apologetics were actually part of his journey back to faith after losing his faith in his teens. So he's going to be defending this argument for God from consciousness today, arguing that we are in essence immaterial beings, unlike materialists who claim that humans are essentially physical brains. Well, we'll be finessing all that out as we get into the discussion today, but he'll debate that with Arif today, and then we'll explore why Czar believes that God is the best explanation for the existence of immaterial minds. So I'm asking you, if you're listening, to switch your brain into top gear, because this is definitely one where we'll need to concentrate, because we have two very switched-on guests joining me for this discussion. Welcome along to the studio, gentlemen. Great to have you with me.
Hi, it's good to be back.
Let's begin with you, Czar, someone who we've never had on before, but I've seen you popping up in my Facebook feed every so often. You seem to be someone who is very interested in the philosophical arguments for God. Do you want to just give us a bit of background to where that all came from?
Yes, so like most people, as a teenager, I began asking questions relevant to mainly the philosophy of religion. At the time, I was a skeptic, an atheist, at some times agnostic, and those were for a variety of reasons. But when I discovered philosophy as a teenager, I came to believe that those reasons were, or those objections to my previous theistic belief, were quite poor, and that opened me up once again to theism. And when I started studying philosophy, I found many of the arguments for the existence of God to be convincing. All of the reasons that led me away from my previous Christian belief no longer seemed convincing to me. So that started the process by which I eventually came back to my original Christian beliefs. And it also, the questions in the philosophy of religion in which I was interested was also the reason I chose to pursue philosophy academically.
Sure.
And now my interests have expanded to more secular questions in philosophy, and presently I'm a student of philosophy at the University of Oxford, studying personal ontology, which is relevant to our discussion today.
It certainly is. In a sense, then, obviously you've had an intellectual journey. Do you kind of tend to be that kind of an analytical type of a person, whatever the issue may be, your faith included?
Well, I like to think that I base my beliefs according to the evidence. But of course, I could be mistaken about the force of that evidence. But yes, I do believe that. I do believe theism because I believe the evidence supports it, not for any other reason.
That's interesting. From Florida originally as well, isn't it?
Yes, I'm originally from Florida.
And good to have you with us
Thank
today,
you for having me.
Cesar. Arif, welcome back to the programme.
Hi, Justin. It's good
great
to see you again.
It's great to have you on. You've told us your story before, but for those who maybe aren't familiar, you kind of adopted an atheistic view at a reasonably young age, I think, was it, in your teens?
Yeah, early teens, I would say. Yep.
And presumably for similar reasons, in a sense, to Cesar, that this was where you saw the evidence.
Yeah, that's right. I totally agree with Cesar that the question should be settled on the basis of evidence and argument, and not, for instance, on the basis of feelings. And my own view was and remains that the evidence, specifically the empirical evidence, leads in the opposite direction. That is, it leads away from any form of religious belief and towards atheism. That is, the belief that there are no divinities of any sort.
Mm-hmm. And you've obviously pursued similarly a philosophical direction in terms of your academic studies. I mean, people who have only heard you on this show might think that's all you do. I mean, in terms of arguing against God. Presumably, your interests are a bit wider than that, philosophically speaking. Yeah,
that's right. So there are two sort of main areas of professional interest that I have. One of them is in the theory of decision, which is about how people make choices in the face of uncertainty. And there are questions about how they do in fact make those choices, questions about how they should make those choices. There's a connection there with theology if you think about cases like Pascal's wager. So there is a connection, though that isn't one I've explored in my own professional life. The other area of professional interest on which I've written is the philosophy of Wittgenstein. And again, that's not really for religious reasons. If anything, Wittgenstein's religious views were entirely opposed to the ones that I think are correct.
Right.
But he wrote both brilliantly and obscurely, which I think makes him a worthwhile object of scholarship.
And like many other philosophers. But we will try and keep this as far as we can, today's discussion, at a level where hopefully lots of people can engage, though inevitably it's going to be on the more philosophical end of the spectrum. And if you're listening and you'd like to respond to anything you hear on today's programme, be very happy to read any emails you have in response. Just email in unbelievable@premier.org.uk, or equally leave a comment underneath today's show at the website, or equally you can find me via Facebook and Twitter at UnbelievableJB, the Twitter account to follow, and facebook.com/UnbelievableJB if you want to find the Facebook page of the show. All those links and more are the place to comment from the website of today's programme. That's premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
So, Cesar, perhaps we'll start with you, because, in a sense, you're the one with an argument to bring for the existence of God today. And we're going to be trying to cram a lot into today's show, so we'll inevitably have to cut a few corners as we go along. But very briefly, do you want to kind of sketch out the totality of your argument and what Arif's going to be responding to today?
Right. So the argument from consciousness is, I shall understand it, is an argument from the fact that human minds are immaterial substances to the existence of God. Now, obviously, there's no logical connection between the two. That is to say, there's no contradiction that can be proven from the conjunction of atheism and substance dualism. In other words, they are consistent. So the argument is going to have to be an explanatory one, according to which theism provides a good explanation of the fact that human minds are non-physical and they interact with the physical world, whereas, for example, naturalism does not provide an adequate explanation of that fact, if it is indeed a fact, and we'll discuss that. But the argument is, again, that human minds are non-physical substances. The explanation of the fact is either naturalistic or personal. It's not naturalistic, so it's personal. And that's just a rough sketch of the argument.
So essentially, if you were to boil it down into two parts, it would be, firstly, you're going to make an argument that humans are non-physical in terms of their mind, if you like, that being essentially what they are. And that, secondly, if we were to accept that, that would be a good argument for theism, but not a good argument for atheism, because theism would be the better explanation for a non-physical mind. Is that a roughly kind of
yes, that's fine. It's a claim that theism explains that fact better. Now, it might be that atheism has overwhelming evidence in other areas that would counterbalance that. But the claim is just that theism, or the claim in its most modest form would be that the existence of non-physical minds is evidence for theism against naturalism.
Well, the first thing we've got to do, of course, is to establish that there's a good case for non-physical minds. Okay,
yes.
So I've described this as a soul in my introduction. I don't know if you use that terminology yourself, whether that's misleading or...
Yeah, I think it's helpful, but people might be inclined to think that the word soul it kind of implies a spooky, Casper ghost-like substance, and I don't think that's. I think that would be a caricature. But I'm happy with the word soul. Yeah.
As long as we know we're talking about, as you say, an immaterial mind. Okay, so there's a number of arguments you could draw into this, but
yes.
we'll probably have to limit ourselves, say, to one at this point. So what's your main argument that you would give for the fact that humans are immaterial minds?
Yeah, so the argument that I find persuasive is not at all novel. It's been around for a while, goes as far back at least to Descartes, and it's been defended more recently by Alvin Plantinga. But it's a modal argument for substance dualism. And before I get into the argument, I should like to make a few clarifications. There are, I shall assume, such things as modal properties. So modal properties are properties about the way things possibly are or necessarily are.
Okay.
And we have modal properties in addition to, for example, our physical properties. I have the property of possibly being an atheist. I know this because I once was an atheist. I'm not now an atheist, but nevertheless, it's still true of me that it's possible that I should be an atheist, and therefore I have the property possibly is an atheist. Arif likewise has the property of possibly being a theist, perhaps in a distant possible world, but nevertheless, it's a property that he has. And so that's the first clarification. The second one is what's called Leibniz's law, according to which X and Y are identical only if they share all and only the same properties. So that if X has a property that Y lacks, then it follows X and Y are not identical.
Not identical.
Right?
Okay. Yeah. Follow you.
So the structure of the argument is to show that the body has a property that I lack. And it follows from Leibniz's law that I can't be identical to my body, or, as I shall argue, any part of it, any proper part of it.
Okay, I think I'm following that. Okay,
Right.
Keep going.
So the argument more formally involves the premise that my body has the property, the modal property, possibly exists when Caesar doesn't. Okay? But Caesar does not have the property possibly exists when Caesar doesn't.
Okay.
And so given Leibniz's law, it follows that
Caesar is not identical with
my body. Right?
Yeah.
And you can run the same argument for any proper material part of my body, and you just get the same conclusion. So it would follow that I'm not identical to my body or any proper part of it. Given the plausible proposition that if I were a material object, I would have to be one of those things.
Okay, for those who are at this point a little bit, struggling to keep up here, give us a kind of an example of this, if you like. So, for instance, how would, in the real world, what would this look like? So, would this mean that someone who's died, say, and their body is lying in a casket, we wouldn't say of them that they are that person anymore?
Yes, that's a good example. So, in the case of death, even on materialism, I think many materialists would be inclined to think that you have a body there, but the person no longer is associated with that body. The person ceased to exist.
Sure.
Nevertheless, the body persists. There are other cases, even in the cases in which people, or even the cases in which the organism is still alive. So, for example, organisms that have suffered irreversible brain damage. Many people will be inclined to suppose that the person has left us,
Yes.
right? And therefore that's why it
all
would
you're
not
really
be
left with is
right.
a living brain, but not a
Right.
a person.
Right. The person has left us. Nevertheless,
Yeah.
it's the same organism because it's biologically continuous with the organism that existed previously. And another case, this is legend, of course, but Albert Einstein's cerebrum is supposedly in a vat filled with formaldehyde. It's not true, but just suppose that it were true. Nobody would suppose that that's Albert Einstein. So his brain persisted, but nevertheless, he ceased to exist, presumably when he died. So these are cases, I think, from ordinary experience, which indicate that you could have the same body without it being associated with the same person. And that implies, I think, the premise. Another argument that you could give, and this is the argument that I think dualists typically give, is an argument from the conceivability of my body's existing without me and me existing without my body. So I can see no contradiction in either of those two propositions. It can be coherently supposed to be the case. Some philosophers believe that conceivability entails possibility, but you don't need that claim. All you need is the more modest claim that conceivability, if we can conceive some propositions being true, then that's at least evidence that it is true. And if that's the case, then we have evidence from conceivability for the possibility premise in this argument.
Okay. Well, I think we've got the basics there for Arif to respond to then. This is an argument that we are not the same as our body, that when I die, if you like, what is laid out in the casket is not Justin. It's a body, and therefore, by this modal argument, if you like, we're distinct from the body, and this gives us evidence that we are actually an immaterial mind. Okay, Arif, this is kind of for you guys now just to talk to each other and debate this out.
Okay, good, thanks. I appreciate the argument, and as Cesar says, it's of a type that goes back to Descartes. The one thing I will point out is that in your own example, Justin, you didn't use the typically Cartesian manoeuvre of appealing to what Cesar calls modal properties. You could perfectly well argue that a person is not his body on the grounds that his body will exist in the future at a time when he does not. And then there's no reference to modality or any such thing is involved in that argument to show that you are not your body, but it still involves Leibniz's law. That's just a side point and not really to do with my main concerns with the argument. Turning now to those, I mean, one concern I have is to do with the notion of modal properties themselves. I think, by which I mean the sorts of things that Cesar illustrated by saying it's a property of you that you might have been a philosopher, or you might have been an atheist, or you might have done such and such other thing. I think it's a source of confusion to say that things have modal properties, because I think really it all depends on how those things are described. This is a sort of, in a way, this connects with the debate that goes back, I suppose, to Aristotle, and the ancient idea that things have essences. That is, they have some properties of them which they couldn't possibly have failed to possess without failing to exist. Now, certain versions of that idea were demolished by Darwin when it was thought there was no such thing as the immutable essence of species, for instance. But there is still surviving in metaphysics this idea that individual things have these modal properties. I myself think it all depends on how you describe them. So, for instance, to take some well-known examples, if we say, could the Prime Minister of England not have been the Prime Minister of England? Well, if you describe him in that way, no, he couldn't have failed to be. But could David Cameron have failed to be the Prime Minister of England? Well, if you describe him in that way, he could have failed to be. Yes. So it all depends. It all seems to me to be relative to the way in which you describe the thing, and doesn't really reveal any essential feature of the thing itself at all.
So you've got a problem with just the modal arguments in general, and for that reason you'd see that as a barrier.
Well, if that were, I mean, if the point that I just made were true, then the application of Leibniz's law itself would fail in this particular case.
And before we come back to Cesar, any other kind of, if you moved beyond that, say, would you have a kind of a problem with?
Yes, I do.
The argument?
So another difficulty with the argument that I have concerns the very notion of a self in the first place. I myself am sympathetic to the view that was supported by David Hume in the 1730s, which is that really it's a mistake to think that we're ever aware of a self at all. That is a single locus of consciousness or subject of all of our experiences.
Okay.
Because we never observe such a thing. There's just no reason to think such a thing exists. There is a bundle of drives, psychological processes, desires, fears, hopes, beliefs, and so on, which, as a kind of interconnected mess, makes up what is your brain.
Okay.
And bits of that go away at sometimes, and bits of it reappear at sometimes. Which ones of those are going to be yourself? Seems to me to be
in
a
that
question
sense, the self is a bit of an illusion.
Well,
as far as
yeah,
you're
I mean,
concerned.
I think there are reasons, important reasons why we have to draw sharp lines in various places. So, for instance, if you think about legal cases, so think about when do you turn off somebody's machine if their mental life has ceased, but they're still breathing. Should you turn off the machine? That might turn on your views as to whether they're still there or not.
Yeah.
So important questions turn on how you settle these things. But I don't know whether philosophical empirical inquiry is going to give us an answer to them.
Okay, couple of sturdy challenges there. Then Cesar, this first one then that modal arguments in Arif's view simply don't get off the ground because these properties you speak of don't really exist, or they could be termed in different ways that makes the problem go away.
Well, I think first of all, I think it's perfectly natural to admit modal properties. I think it will be helpful to clarify the different kinds of properties that are relevant. An essential property of an object is a property that thing cannot fail to have. Okay. So in philosophical terminology, a thing has a property essentially if it has that property in every possible world in which it exists. It has a property contingently if it could fail to have that property, right? So I have the property of being a philosopher, and there are possible worlds in which, unfortunately, I'm not a philosopher. And it seems we have to admit at least some essential properties, which are modal properties, because there are obvious truths about me that that require that we admit them. So, for example, it's impossible that I'm an alligator. It just couldn't be the case that this is to use Alvin Plantinga's as example, that I was an alligator. So I have the property of not being an alligator, essentially. That's part of the set of my essential properties. My essence is just that.
In that sense, there's a pretty much infinite set of things that you are not, obviously, that you don't have that you have the property of not being. Well,
perhaps there are an infinite number of things that I'm not, in which case my essence would be quite large. But in any case, I think you do have to admit these modal properties. The second response is you don't actually need to involve the modal properties in order for the argument to go through. All you need is the proposition that that it's possible that my body exists and that I fail to exist. And that would be a case in which, so you'd have a possible world in which my body exists and I don't exist. And given the necessity of identity, I can't be my body.
Yeah. And this leads us on to Arif's second contention, that this sense of I is itself a debatable thing, that the self, we don't observe that. All we are aware of is, as you said, a range of kind of processes going on that constitute our brain and so on. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, so this is the Humean line, and I'm a bit puzzled because I don't see why it's the case that we don't observe something and therefore it doesn't exist, or why we should conclude from the fact that we don't observe something that it doesn't exist, especially on substance dualism. Given substance dualism, it's not at all surprising why we don't observe in at least a certain sense the soul,
immaterial mind. Sure.
But I would say that we certainly have an awareness of ourselves as ourselves. There are ordinary beliefs which I think are perfectly natural that seem to me to be quite obviously true. I mean, I believe, for example, that theism is true. And if that proposition is true, and it certainly seems to be true, then it follows that I exist. So I'm not moved by the proposition that there are no that there aren't any such things as people. I think that's.
Okay.
I think that's
We'll get Arif to respond to that in a moment's time. We've already got through the first part of our show, and we've hardly got into the debate yet. But we'll carry this on in a moment's time. You're listening to a philosophical edition of Unbelievable today, asking, do we have a soul? We're debating that at the moment. And if so, would it provide evidence for God? We'll get to that as well in the course of the show today. Arif Ahmed joins me, senior lecturer in philosophy at Cambridge. He's an atheist. And Czar Bernstein, a young Christian philosopher who is making the case for God from the argument from consciousness, as it's sometimes called. So we'll be back in the saddle debating this in a moment's time here on the show that aims to get you thinking. Unbelievable.
Premier Christianity, for cutting-edge commentary and encouraging stories. Tackling the big issues to help you live out your faith.
It's a politics special this month. We've heard from Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg. Now David Cameron shares with us his vision for how the Conservatives would work with the UK Church if his party won the election. We'll also hear from ordinary Christians on who they're voting for and why. Plus, why is Stephen Fry so angry with God? Christian thinker Vince Vitale examines the TV presenter's outburst on suffering and evil.
For your free copy of Premier Christianity, visit premierchristianity.com/free sample. You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Yes, welcome back to the show that aims to get you thinking. I'm Justin Brierley, with you through till 4 o'clock this afternoon. Don't forget some of your feedback to the last few weeks of programming coming up a little later. Last week's debate on the Big Bang and has it gone bust was an interesting one, and we'll be finding out what you thought about that, as well as other recent editions of the show, as esoteric as the Turin Shroud and much else. But today on the programme, we're having a very philosophical debate on the soul, an immaterial mind. Are we just a body, or are we distinct from the body? That's the view of Czar Bernstein, young Christian philosopher who joins me on the show today to make the argument for God from consciousness. Arif Ahmed is an atheist, senior lecturer in philosophy at Cambridge University, and we've been hearing the debate so far between them. If you want links to my guests today, I'll make sure to post them with today's programme, premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable, and you can add your comments to today's programme there as well. And why not tell other people about Unbelievable if you enjoy listening? They may well want to tune in for themselves and see what it's all about. So premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. Okay, we'll come back to you, Arif, now. Maybe you could just summarise where we got to so far.
Yeah. So just to step back a little bit and summarise the argument. Cesar's argument, which was an interesting variant of a sort of Cartesian argument for there being immaterial souls, was something like this, that I can't be my brain or I can't be my body because those things could have existed even though I didn't. Mm-hmm. But I couldn't have existed when I didn't. So my brain's got a property that I haven't, or my body's got a property that I haven't. So I'm not my brain. That is
a great explanation. That even has helped me to understand what was going on.
Well, I hope it hasn't made you more sympathetic to it. But that was roughly what the argument was. And I had two objections. I did want to mention a third, which I might come to in a moment, but I had two objections. The first one was to do with the idea that things have properties of possibly being such and such, or they might have been such and such, they couldn't have been such and such. And I said, well, you don't say the thing has that property, it all depends how you describe it, and it can be kind of arbitrary. And then the second thing that I wanted to cast doubt on was the whole idea of a self or a me in the first place, because I think that there aren't any selves for roughly Humean reasons. I'll come back to that. And that, in fact, really there's just a bundle of psychological states, drives, passions, beliefs, and so on.
Which we label the
self, but which sometimes that label might become arbitrary, although sharp lines sometimes have to be drawn. Now, Cesar responded to the things that I just said as follows, and he said, in the case of my scepticism about modal property, he says, well, there are some things that we do believe and find it very natural to say, and that he, for instance, couldn't have been an alligator, and that seems quite clearly an essential property of him. Mm-hmm. And in response to the issue concerning the self, he said he was a bit puzzled by my use of the Humean style reasoning, because we don't just believe in what we can see and hear and feel and touch. We believe in plenty of other things too. So the fact that I can't see or hear or feel or touch myself doesn't show that it doesn't exist, if that was either Hume's reasoning or mine. Okay.
So he's won the argument. No, not quite. Okay. I wasn't assuming that.
So I had a couple of things to say in response to that. I mean, in the case of modal properties, notice we have to make a distinction. César will say, for instance, that he couldn't possibly have been an alligator, but he could possibly have been an atheist. These are two things that he doesn't in fact have. But one of them is one that he couldn't have had, and one of them is one that he could have had. I don't see that science or empirical observation or anything that we need to understand how the universe in fact works has any need for that distinction.
Okay.
There are properties, some things are atheists, some things are not, some things are alligators, some things are not. We know about laws connecting these things, that's what tells us how the world actually works. None of that, and nowhere in science, is there ever any use for essential properties or modal properties of these sort. So I think there's no particular reason to believe in them.
Okay. And as an empiricist, I know you're an empiricist, Arif, for you it's about what at the end of the day works, kind of, that's necessary in the world, the universe we live in.
Ultimately, yes. I mean, this is actually a general observation that I had, which was that from an empiricist perspective, what there's reason to believe in is what we need to believe in order to explain what we observe. And this brings me to the second point, because César was quite right that by mentioning Hume in the way that I did, I could seem to have been arguing in a very crude way that we don't see it, therefore it's not there. But there's a difference between only believing in what you see and only believing in what explains what you see. For instance, I believe in numbers and I can't see them. I believe in black holes and nobody's ever seen them. We believe in all of these things because they help to explain what we do observe. Sure. Now, I don't see that any self, particularly not an immaterial self, but in any case, any kind of self, plays an essential role in explaining what we do observe about human behaviour, human psychology, or any of these other facts that are ultimately the only data that we have. I mean, that brings me, I guess, to the final point I wanted to make as well, which was that just a general methodological suspicion about drawing, extremely serious and ultimately life-changing conclusions on the basis not of evidence rooted in what we observe and what we need to postulate to explain what we observe, but in the basis of what I think are fairly airy and equivocal metaphysical speculations about what might have been the case or could have been the case or couldn't have been the case, which seem to me a lot of the time to have no particularly firm discipline.
Okay. Really helpful, both summary of where we got to and further kind of debate on the top of it. So here we are then, César. Again, we've got these two elements that we're debating here: the modal argument itself, and César's view that, Arif's view that this self, isn't the best explanation of what we actually observe. So, quick responses on both of those.
Right. So the first reply was science doesn't need the distinction. That there are some properties that I couldn't have failed to have, some properties that I
possibly could have had.
Right. Science doesn't make that distinction, and so presumably the conclusion to draw from that is, therefore, neither should we. And I'm inclined to say that I find that argument just terribly unpersuasive. That science doesn't need that distinction. I'm inclined to just say, so what? Philosophers need that distinction. The science is not the only way to knowledge. If my argument for the reality of these properties works, that just shows that we need the distinction despite sciences not admitting that
So you think that's a sort of a red herring in a way? It's it's a non sequitur, is it, if you like, to the fact that.
Well, I think it's. I don't think it's a good argument. We'll put it that way. So that's the first response. The second response is you might question the idea that science doesn't need the distinction. I'm not confident in this response, but this is perhaps how someone might respond. We might say, for example, that sugar has the property of possibly being dissolved in water. Right? It has that dispositional property. It's disposed to dissolve when it's in water. And that seems to figure in the explanation of our observation that, in fact, it does dissolve. The reason it, in fact, does dissolve is that it has, as an essential property, this modal property. So that's a second response. The third response I had, to which Arif didn't respond was that you actually don't need. You can just restructure the argument to avoid this
particular problem.
Particular problem. Leave out modal properties and just say there's a possible state of affairs in which my body exists and I don't. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, then
you're not.
I can't be identical to my body, given that identity is a necessary relation.
We'll maybe get Arif to respond to that as well. Yeah. Okay, and turning to the other issue of the self.
Right, yes. So the second claim was the self doesn't play an essential role in explanation, and I don't think that's the case. We know, for example, that there are in the world instantiated mental properties.
Okay, you're going to have to explain what those are.
Okay, well, mental property. Best way I think is by examples. So beliefs are mental properties. Pain is a mental property.
Okay.
These properties are instantiated.
And what do you mean by instantiated?
That is that there are things that have them.
Okay.
If there are, I should clarify, there are pains, mm-hmm. and in order to explain the fact that there are these events and properties,
there has to be something experiencing.
There has to be something whose pain it is.
Okay.
That's the only way to make sense of the idea that there is a mental event, and that's because events are just properties instantiated in substances at times.
Okay.
If that's the case, then it's obvious that you need to have a subject whose properties these are.
So a self,
right.
Because these things don't exist independently of such a self that owns the pain or the mental event that's going on.
Right. Yeah. It seems odd to say that there is a pain that nothing feels.
Yes.
I mean that if it's not a contradiction, it certainly seems very implausible. And I understand that's Hume's position, but I fail to detect an argument for why we should accept this kind of this view, according to which the fact that the self doesn't figure into our explanations, that therefore we should eliminate the self, given the fact that it's just immediately apparent to everyone that that we exist.
Do you sort of take it as what Plantinga sometimes calls a basic belief? Or,
yes, basic. Right. So a basic belief is a belief that isn't believed on the basis of any other beliefs. It's held in a basic way, and I would say that this is a properly basic belief.
Yes.
But there might even be absurdity, as I mentioned before, in denying the self, because you're then committed to pain floaters, for example, without anything that's feeling, thoughts that nothing is thinking.
It's an interesting idea. Okay, so again, two areas that we're still debating here, Arif. Just take us back to the argument for mode. He gave César gave some ideas of why he might want to hold on to his modal argument. But he said even if we abandoned it, I can still formulate the argument in a way which doesn't depend on modal logic and so on. So any responses there? Yeah,
it may just be a case where our differences are quite deep and can't be resolved by anything short of violence or something like that. That is to say, you might take the view, which is, I guess, more or less my view, that the empirical method is one that's worked, that's given us Western civilization, and is by far the most successful method of finding anything out that anyone has ever devised, and that ought to be the touchstone of anything else. And everything, including ordinary, intuitive, common-sense beliefs, have to go if it doesn't support them. That's one view you might take. You might take an alternative view, which is the sort of view that César, and I must admit many philosophers take, which is that many of these other things are things we're entitled to hold on to, unless in the face of really strong grounds for giving them up. Yeah. So there's a kind of methodological conflict there. Probably best not to go much further into that, simply because we may hit rock bottom at some point.
I think we probably have already. But yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah. On the claim that the argument can be reformulated without appeal to these things in any case, I think the way César proposed to reformulate it can't be quite right, because you could, it seems on the face of it, argue that, there's a possible world in which David Cameron exists, but nobody is the Prime Minister. Certainly there's a possible world in which that's true, because we might have had a different constitution. Yeah. It doesn't follow that, in fact, David Cameron isn't the Prime Minister. because he is. Clearly that would be an argument with, it seems, a true premise and a false conclusion. It would seem that you also need, and there is a slightly technical issue here, it would seem that you also need the supposition that what are involved are what are called rigid designators, that is, terms that specify the same property or the same thing in all possible situations. And that, when we import that assumption into the reformulation of the argument, it may be that we'll end up with, it'll end up being something that a sufficiently consistent and intelligent materialist would want to reject. This was the shape of the debate in the 70s, for instance, between people like Kripke, who proposed a version of this argument, they're not involving the self, and David Lewis, on whose side I would be in this type of dispute.
So, and then coming to the self, and I'm probably sorry to have to move it on, just because I'm aware we also want to get to the second part of what Cesar's proposing, but so just to recap again what Cesar had to say on that, it's a properly basic belief at some level, he would say, the idea of a self, but also these instantiated mental properties, pain and so on, has to belong to something. It seems bizarre to say that it just sort of exists.
Yeah, sure. Okay, good.
Out of that context.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I would say is that, Cesar may say, maybe you would say this too, that it's something that's completely evident to all of us, but it's not evident to me. I mean, this does go back to what Hume was saying. I'm aware of beliefs and pains and so on, but I'm not aware of anything that has them. The second thing I would say is, of course, you needn't deny a self. You could just say that a self is a composite object. That is, it's a bundle of drives and beliefs and sensations and so on. So one needn't be denying the existence of a thing. The third thing to say is that if you think about it, it needn't be so absurd to say that there are pains and so on that are not actually owned by anyone if we have a materialistic perspective. What does that really mean? It just means there are certain electrical events, neural events, going on inside this bit of wiring. That is the bit inside one's skull. No, neural events, electrical events can happen without any owner. So if pains are electrical events, then pains can happen without any owner, it seems. So while there may be some sort of, intuitive oddness about it, I don't think it's a mandatory belief.
I think for me it's intuitively odd. It's hard to imagine not thinking of myself as myself, if you like.
Not for Buddhists, for instance. If you're a Buddhist and you think, you can take a view which for them may even seem natural, but is certainly widespread, that really, but I mean, for some extreme versions of the view, I guess you could say there is no self at all, and picking out a self is like picking out a teaspoon from the ocean and arbitrarily parceling that off as a particular bit of water. That's not a mad view, okay? It's a widespread view, and it's one that many people hold.
Okay. Some quick responses, and we will try to move the discussion on a bit, so Cesar.
One thing that Arif just said is, I'm aware of pains, but I'm not aware of anything that has them. That seems to me to be a contradiction. So you're going to have to phrase it in a way that doesn't imply a
self.
A self, right? And I think that's quite difficult to do, because pains as events seem to be essentially felt, right? They're essentially conscious states. That's part of what it means. That's part of the concept of a pain. And if there's a feeling, it's very difficult to see how there can't be something that has the feeling. And that was the initial thought that I had. The second point I should like to address briefly was the David Cameron Prime Minister example. And here I should like to point out that Prime Minister is what I believe is a phase of an object's existence. It's not a substance concept. So another example would be philosopher. There was a time in my life where I was, which I wasn't a philosopher. Now I am a philosopher. We wouldn't say that philosopher is a substance concept, because if it were, then it looks like there's me and a philosopher here. But there's not. It's just a phase of my existence. And once you see that Prime Minister is exactly the same kind of thing, it's a phase of David Cameron's existence, then
and it may soon not be a phase of his existence. Who knows?
Right,
but we'll see.
Yeah, that's so right. It's a phase of his existence. In the light of that distinction, I think the objection fails, because the case that to which I appealed was a case in which we were talking about two substance concepts, namely body and mind. Those are two substances. And in that case, it's very clear that if they're identical, it's impossible that you should have one and not the other.
Okay. I'm afraid there has to be a point at which we sort of come to an end of talking about this aspect of the thing, and I appreciate there would be more responses from you on that as well, Arif. But I feel like we should maybe get to the next stage of this argument and use what time we have left for that as well. Just a reminder, if you're listening and you'd like to yourself contribute in any way to this, unbelievable@premier.org.uk is the way to do that if you want to email me. Equally, you're very welcome to send me in your thoughts via Twitter and Facebook @unbelievablejb or facebook.com/unbelievablejb. Today's show, links to my guests and everything else from the website at premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
Really good discussion today. Though I appreciate that for those who maybe don't get turned on by the whole philosophy thing, it may be one that you're not kind of tracking with so much. But I love it. I'm finding this really interesting, guys. So if you can keep me going, then I'm sure there are many others who are following this. But we do want to kind of, as it were, move to the next stage of the argument. And this is what philosophers often do. Okay, let's say I granted you that there is an immaterial mind, that we are an immaterial mind, not just a body and so on. Would it follow then, anyway, that would provide evidence for theism? Okay, just quickly run for us, and I'll ask you to be brief so that we can make the best use of our time, Cesar, how it would follow, if you could show that we are an immaterial mind, that there's a God.
Right. Well, I certainly wouldn't show conclusively that there's a God. The claim is more modest. It's just that the theistic explanation, or a personal explanation, is a better explanation of that fact than...
It will give you evidence towards a God.
Right. Right. So the claim is theism explains the fact. Naturalism doesn't explain it adequately.
And why would theism be a better explanation of our... Right. Because simply naturalism doesn't allow for immaterial minds?
Well, first I should like to point out that my belief in the second part is I hold it much more tentatively. So at the end of this program, perhaps I might even agree with Arif on this part of the debate. But I do think that theism explains this fact, if indeed there are souls, and I don't think that naturalism can provide an explanation. One reason to think so, well, there are several reasons, we can go into them. One reason is that physical causal closure seems to be a natural fit for naturalism.
Okay, explain that phrase. Right. You'll need to define that.
Physical causal closure is the thesis that all physical events have sufficient physical causes.
Okay.
And it looks like that is going to be incompatible with the proposition that we're discussing today, conjoined with the very plausible proposition that our mental events cause physical events. So ordinarily we believe, for example, that the reason I'm here right now is that I intended to be here. I had the belief that I had committed to coming and that I ought to fulfill my obligations. So part of the explanation for why I'm here is going to involve, part of the causal explanation is going to involve reference to mental properties.
Okay. Not just that your body moved your foot in front of the other and boarded the bus. And
right.
So
it's not a robotic process, in other words. It's not my body didn't just mechanically arrive here. We have to appeal to these mental properties in order to explain the event of my being here. And if minds are in fact non-physical, as I've been arguing, then it looks like you have to admit that there are some physical events, namely the bodily movements which got me here in the first place, are caused by mental events which are non-physical properties of a non-physical substance.
And so just to help me to kind of complete the circle there, and the reason that is best explained by theism is because...
Right. So the claim there was that naturalism doesn't look like it's going to be able to accommodate souls because the existence of souls conjoined with the plausible proposition that our souls interact causally with physical objects implies that causal closure is false. And some naturalists think that causal closure is a logical consequence of naturalism, but certainly I think it's very plausible that it is a natural fit for naturalism. And so I think that would undermine a naturalistic explanation for the existence of souls, if you have to give up causal closure.
Well, let's allow Arif a little chance to respond on this.
Okay, thanks. There's a few things to say. I guess one place I'd like to start is just on the issue of different kinds of explanation. You might very well think, without believing that we're robots, that there is a physical, causal explanation of everything that happens. So, for instance, you might think that, sure, we can describe Cesar's reasons for being here in the very natural terms that he set out, the very intuitive terms that he set out just now. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if, as a matter of fact, we could at least in principle tell a story in which contractions of his muscles were caused by secretion of certain chemicals in his brain and electrical currents passing through his nerves. Those, in turn, could be explained by various other chemical events in his brain.
You could tell a sort of mechanistic story all the way back.
That's right. If you think that that's true, then you might think that the physical causal closure is preserved. The causes of all physical events are causal. Nevertheless, there might be some distinct kind of explanation which is not a causal explanation, perhaps an intentional or teleological explanation, which doesn't explain by citing causes, but explains by fitting something into a broader network. So I'm not sure that there's any severe conflict with naturalism or with materialism in mind there. That's one issue. The second issue, I suppose, concerns. Well, let me put it like this. The argument as presented, it seems to me, doesn't give us any reason to believe in anything remotely resembling theism, specifically even the Christian theism, has anything going for it at all. An explanation which appealed to any kind of conscious state, it seems, would be as good as any other. So one that appealed to Satan, or that appealed to Father Christmas, or that appealed to any of these other immaterial things, is equally confirmed by this phenomenon, as far as the argument shows. The second thing I wanted to say. The third thing I wanted to say is that, of course, a desideratum on good explanations, I would think, is that they make good novel predictions. Now, scientific explanations do make novel predictions. That's why we believe them. That's why we think Newton was right, and that's what, over Aristotle, why we prefer Darwin to Lamarck, why we prefer Einstein to Newton, for instance, because they make novel predictions, which we can then test. This kind of explanation not only makes no novel predictions, but, depending on how it's fleshed out, though it hasn't yet been, it may be that it leaves all kinds of other intolerable mysteries, which actually mean it's a far worse explanation, even if we accept immaterialism, than scientific-type explanations.
Okay, lots to digest there, and we're going to give you a quick break to digest it and be back in a moment for the final part of today's programme. Hasn't the time flown by? We're getting into sort of the meat now of whether if we could make the case for an immaterial mind, would that be evidence for God, for theism? With my guests today, Arif Ahmed and Czar Bernstein. A very philosophical debate on Unbelievable today. We like to throw these at you every so often. It wasn't that long ago we did the ontological debate. So I know that, Arif, you're interested in listening to that. I'll send you the link for that one. But in any case, we hope you're keeping up, and we'll be back in just a moment's time on the other half of a short break to conclude today's discussion. Welcome back to Unbelievable with me, Justin Brierley, the final part of today's show, and we'll be concluding our discussion on consciousness and whether it points towards God with my guests today. If you're listening later on in the programme, you'll hear some feedback to last week's programme on the Big Bang and Has It Gone Bust. Jeff Swearink and Phil Harper joined me for that, and a number of people got in touch to say they feel that a stronger case could be made for a beginning to the universe than was made on that show. So we'll hear some of the feedback in that case to that. A number of Christians who have been in touch about that. Also coming up, Tyson Bradley joins me. He's going to be talking about a new set of events happening at Westminster Chapel here in central London from tomorrow, Sunday the 16th of April. It's called Mythbusters. It's a Q&A series which is ideal to bring along non-Christians too. So listen out for more details about that towards the end of today's programme. Next week on Unbelievable, we're going to be debating, does the Bible forbid same-sex relationships? We're going to have a complete change of gear, focus and topic next week as my guest Robert Gagnon, who's becoming well known as a conservative voice in US biblical scholarship circles on this issue, joins me to debate that with Jane Ozanne, who's the director of Accepting Evangelicals. She joined me a month or two back in a programme with Steve Chalk and Ed Shaw as well. So Robert Gagnon and Jane Ozanne on Does the Bible Forbid Same-Sex Relationships at the same time next week. And if you want to check back on past episodes, more resources and leave comments about today's programme, premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. Links there, of course, to the Twitter and Facebook as well. Later on in today's schedule for Faith Explored, you can hear the profile interview between 4 and 5. Moiwa speaks to Paul Lee, who's going to be the new presenter of a brand new show on Premier Gospel called The Sunday Show. You can guess when it's going to be airing. But in any case, look out for that. Paul Lee on the profile between 4 and 5 this afternoon. Right now, let's finish up today's discussion.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Two guests today who find each other unbelievable, though it is, of course, a very kind of intellectual debate today that we're actually having. Evidence on both sides and really well argued today by my guests Cesar and Arif as they've debated the existence of an immaterial mind and if there was that, whether it would provide evidence for God. And that's where we've got to in our discussion so far. I hope you've been listening hard and keeping up with all this. Okay, I'm going to ask you then, Cesar, to sort of summarise where we've got to in this second part of our argument, because I think you've been making the case that if this immaterial mind can be shown to be what we constitute us, it doesn't sit well with naturalism. It sits much better with theism as an explanation for that. And you talked about causal closure, I think it was the phrase, and Arif responded. Well, what was Arif's response, and then perhaps you can you can give us your.
Yeah, well, one response was that you can have a purely physical, mechanistic explanation without having the view that we're just robots. That's what I understood it, and I agree with that, but only if you add the proposition that mental events just are physical events, because I think that in order to explain why I'm here, you have to appeal to intentions. You could have a purely physical explanation of why I'm here, but again, only if, for example, intentions, beliefs are physical events. And the reason I believe that is because if they are distinct, and you want to just give a purely physical explanation of why I'm here, that explanation it's going to be coherent or consistent to suppose that I would be here even if I didn't have the intention, even if I didn't intend to come, even if I didn't have the belief that I was committed to come, even if I didn't have any of these mental events. And it seems very, very odd to suppose that I would be here even if these mental events didn't happen. So I agree, you can have a physical explanation of why I'm here, but only if these mental events just are physical events, and as I've argued in the first section, that's false. So again, you're going to have to appeal to again, this isn't going to be an adequate explanation of our experience. Yeah. The second point, which is I think a very good one and one that's right to make, is that, well, how do you get to the God of classical theism? This argument would equally well confirm, for instance, Satan, or presumably a morally imperfect or evil but very powerful being. Yes. One response to this is that the argument doesn't need to show that that there is a God of classical theism in order to be an interesting argument if it shows that there is a very powerful non-physical being that created the laws governing, the psychophysical laws governing the trillions of mental correlations. That's in itself an interesting philosophical conclusion. But I think we can say more that would support the God of classical theism here. If you have a morally perfect being and an omnipotent being, you would expect such a being, and this is something that you could predict from that hypothesis, you would expect such a being to desire to create finite beings with whom he can have a loving and meaningful relationship. So it's not at all surprising, it seems to me, on classical theism that there should be people. There are other facts about us which I think favor that hypothesis. That hypothesis makes better sense of other facts about us. So, for example, we have moral intuitions. Our moral judgments tend to be benevolent. Our initial intuitive moral judgments are just what we would expect to have if they were
the product
of a benevolent and loving being. But it's not at all clear that if there were a morally imperfect being, that our base moral intuition should be should tend towards being loving and benevolent, right?
Yeah, okay. Well, it kind of takes us into a whole other area that we have done before as well. Stephen Law famously sort of supports this idea of the evil God hypothesis and so on. But in any case, a few things to respond to there. Arif, any thoughts?
Yeah, good. I think on the first point, I kind of have some sympathy with what Cesar was saying. So I suppose I would see it really as a kind of threat to the first premise rather than to the second. But it does seem. But if you take that route, it does seem as though the first premise is hostage to empirical fortune. If it turned out that, as a matter of fact, we could indeed get the sort of explanation that I speculated upon, we could indeed explain in terms of hormones and electrical currents and the contraction of muscles and so on, some kind of causal story that led to Cesar's physical movements up until this point, then that would be grounds against accepting the first premise. But that seems to me to be an empirical question. That's one we can't settle in the armchair. We have to go out and look at things, and I think there's reasonable grounds to think that, as a matter of fact, such explanations are available. On the point concerning alternative explanations, not just the classical theistic explanation, but alternative explanations for these things. I think I heard Cesar effectively conceding, though I don't know whether he called it a concession, that this part of the argument does depend on some kind of satisfactory theodicy. Okay, and clearly this is not the time and place, I guess, to go into that. But it would indeed, the question of whether this is a good explanation or whether classical theism is an especially good explanation is going to depend on its making kind of predictions about our world that are borne out in what we observe. For instance, you might equally say, sure, a good and loving God would have a motive to create finite beings with whom he could have a loving relationship. But then equally a satanic being would have a motive to create finite beings with whom he could have a hating relationship. And it's not entirely clear which of those relationships we stand in. The other thing that I would say, which is a more general point, is that evidence confirms everything that entails it. So in a sense, the idea of confirmation is that evidence is a very weak idea. And saying that something is evidence for theism can seem misleading because it sounds as though you've got really grounds that are worth mentioning for believing in this doctrine. But there is a very loose sense of evidence, which is, I think, maybe the one that's operative here if this argument is going to work, according to which anything that entails this, Satan, fairies, talking trees, Father Christmas, the God of classical theism, the gods of polytheism are all equally well confirmed. So none of them are particularly well confirmed by this kind of evidence. Sure. So I think this kind of argument... I
mean, at best, it would be that naturalism is disconfirmed, if you like.
Well, I mean, that was the other issue. I mean, I don't really see why that should be the case. If you accept immaterialism, then it seems as though you could perfectly well, I think, have natural laws, for instance, governing the correlations between neural states and immaterial states. Indeed, this comes back to a point which I mentioned at the very start but didn't have time to go into, which was that, as Locke, for instance, pointed out, an immaterial God could perfectly well annex consciousness to this table as he could to the complicated neural network in my brain. So the sort of explanation that's being envisaged, I think, would leave it a mystery, and in my view an intolerable mystery, why it is that we're conscious but tables are not. On the other hand, scientific-type explanations might very well say that, fine, consciousness is immaterial, mental states are immaterial, but here are some laws governing when they emerge from sufficiently complex neural configurations.
Sure. Any response to that particular kind of...
Yeah, there were 3 points. So the Satan example, we don't know whether we're in a hating relationship as opposed to a loving relationship, but I gave an argument or a reason why theism gets a bigger boost than the Satan hypothesis, and that's why, and that's because we have the kinds of moral beliefs that we in fact do have.
There's a theodicy at work that for you justifies a sort of...
it's not... I don't know that I would say it's a theodicy. It's just the claim that we would expect a good God to instill in us moral beliefs that are largely like the ones that we do have, but it seems to me that a satanic or a morally imperfect being wouldn't at all incline us towards being loving. In fact, it would probably be hateful.
Which many people are.
Right, and absolutely, many people are. There are exceptions, and those have to be accommodated. But the point is that given that the overwhelming majority of people throughout history have the kinds of moral beliefs we would expect to have if at least minimally morally decent being existed, that this fact would confirm the theistic hypothesis over the satanic one. And I agree with Arif that evidence is not by itself... The claim that there's evidence for some proposition is not in itself an interesting claim. I think that we would have to include other facts about the world in order to get to a conclusion that the existence of God is probable given the evidence. So this claim is really that the probability of theism is boosted by this fact, but not necessarily that the probability of theism is greater than half given the evidence.
But what about this final thing that Arif raised, that, but you know, given that a God could provide a table with consciousness, but the fact is that all we are aware of is that complex brains produce consciousness, which sort of seems to tally with naturalism and not give us a reason to believe in.
Right. So one thing I would say is I just turn the problem on Arif. I think there's a pairing problem if there are souls for naturalism. It's hard to see how or why we should why there would be a causal relationship between my mind, for example, and my body on naturalism. You'd have to appeal to a relation that connects the two. And on naturalism, it seems the only relation to which you could appeal is a spatial relation. The reason my mind is paired, if you like, with this body is that there's a relevant kind of spatial relationship that's not had by a qualitatively identical mind that happens to be attached to another body. So this is Kim's argument against dualism, but I think it's only an argument against naturalistic dualism because, of course, on theism, God being omnipotent can just will it be the case that my mind is causally attached to my body. Yeah. So there's no mystery on theism. And again, that's another
whole area to develop,
right,
in a way. But
right. but that's another line of argument as to why tables aren't conscious. It could just be a contingent fact that tables aren't that God hasn't chosen tables instead of organisms. But I mean, it seems obvious that He would want to embody us in a thing that's able to do more than just stay in one place. I mean, it's a great thing that I was able to come to London, and I don't think I would have been able to do that if I were a table.
Okay. Look, it's been really interesting. Arif, any final words just as we start to just sign out today's show?
I mean, just very briefly on at least one of the last things that Cesar said. I think when you give explanations of why of causes, some of these explanations always have to come to an end somewhere. I mean, in effect, he was conceding that with the case about tables as well. It could have been that God just said, tables are conscious and brains are not. And equally, we can just say, just as we do in quantum mechanics, for instance, and nobody, I think, thinks that involves an appeal to divine intervention. This uranium atom does decay, this one doesn't, that they started out in the same case. That just happens. Okay? So there are going to be, at some level, of course, there are going to be basic laws or basic regularities in the structure of the world on the basis of which we can explain other things. That in itself was always recognised, was always a feature of naturalism. So merely pointing out that it's the case can't in itself refute naturalism.
Okay.
And as I said, it seems promising that it can give a richer and more sophisticated and more predictive account of these things, just as neurophysiology is doing right now, and promises to do in the future. And I see no reason, in principle, why we couldn't have a wholly satisfying physical explanation of consciousness.
Thank you for being on the show today, Arif. Any last words from you, Cesar, as we conclude?
I just want to point out that the main objection, the most substantial objection to the first part of the show, that is substance dualism, to which Arif appealed, was the proposition that people don't exist. And I want to point out that whether you're a theist or an atheist, if you agree with me that it's a plausible proposition that people exist and that the only question is whether people are material or immaterial, then we haven't heard anything today that ought to convince you that the argument for substance dualism, to which I appealed, doesn't work.
Okay.
Or at least the main objection doesn't work. In which case you'd have to deny one of the premises in some other way. And given that people do exist, I do think it's quite plausible that we are non-physical substances. And I do think that this gives at least a moderate boost to theism over naturalism.
There you go. Okay. Modest claims today on the show in that sense, but nonetheless, very interesting debate as we've sort of worked our way through the issues here. Thanks both for being with me. Really great to have you on.
Thank you. It's great to be on.
Thank you.
And I look forward to perhaps delving into some other philosophical argument for the existence of God in the future. But for the moment, my guests today have been Arif Ahmed, Czar Bernstein. I'm going to make sure there are links to both their websites and so on from today's programme. And we're just at the end of our discussion time, and just a little bit of time to hear some of your feedback towards the end of today's programme, coming up in just a moment.